think about it, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go.
So Mike, and Mike, first of all, thanks for having me on. Let me also, people always do get confused about the insider threat because they'll look at a report and say, well, 80% of breaches had an external threat element and 25% of breaches or incidents had an internal threat element, and oh my God, that's 105% of breaches. What's wrong here with my math? And it's not that we're using some advanced calculus or anything. In a large percentage of breaches or in security incidents, there's both an internal and an external element to these incidents. As I think we're going to get into, the issue is while the external elements seem to get a lot of press and a lot of attention, the insider threat continues to grow. But I'll save it for you, Mike.
No, that's absolutely right. It's actually, there's some news out today. A company in Germany was breached, and it's a combination of external and internal, they believe. So right on.
Communications company.
Right on point, yes. And to Alan's point, if you look at some of the stats we have up on the screen, external threats do make up the majority of what we're talking about. I think that folks like you guys on the line listening are doing a good job defending against them. So we're seeing some decrease in the number of successful penetrations. Internal threats, on the other hand, are on the rise. Still a smaller number, but it's getting to the point where we just can't ignore them anymore. One of the things in my role as VP operations, one of the things I always look for in my employees is continuous improvement, right? You look for that in yourself, you look for that for the people you work with and the people that work for you, and you want to be continuously getting better. One of the areas you don't want to see that, however, is with insider threats, and if you look at some of these stats, it's getting easier and faster to get data out of the company, and it's getting harder to detect or discover that it happened.
Yeah, right. Mike, if I can give us a security industry sort of view on this at a macro level, I don't think we've gotten better on external threats, frankly. I think it's really a question of who sucks more. And, we frankly are sucking a lot more detecting insider threats than we are external threats. So detected external threats are not growing as quickly as the phenomenal rate that internal threats, as you see on the screen, have increased by 250%, which is just crazy. But to say we're doing a better job on external, and maybe not so much. But certainly we need to have a bit more focus on those internal threats.
Thanks, Alan.
Okay.
One of the things to think about when we talk about the insider threat is just how the progression of technology has made it easier to get data out of the company, right? And I don't want to dwell on it too long, but we've gone from, when I was a kid and would visit my father's office in New York, giant printers that were printing off a mainframe terminal, and if you wanted to get something, you printed it, and the guy from the mailroom brought it up to you, so it was very public. Down through USB sticks to now you can drag and drop box something out of a company in a second, and it's very difficult to do that. And I think that ease of being able to get data outside is affecting kind of how people think about the right or wrong associated with that. So as we go to the next slide here, and you look at some of these statistics, one of the ones that jumps out on me right away is the number of people, 51%, that think it's okay to take corporate data with them when they leave a company.
Absolutely. Mike, if I can, I think I was telling you before we started today, I spoke to a friend of, I'm ashamed to say, a friend of mine who told me he'll probably be terminated from his position in the next couple of weeks. He's looking for a new job, asked me if I could help him find a new job. And I said, perhaps. And he said, well, the first thing I'm doing is I'm going in tomorrow with a USB drive, and I'm copying down all of my spreadsheets, my contacts, downloading Salesforce. And I'm thinking to myself, is this someone I want to recommend for a new job to someone else I know? But it goes to what you said, our expectations of what is permissible, what is allowed, what is okay, really are as whacked as our privacy, what we expect from our privacy on Facebook and other social networks, right? Mm-hmm. And again, taking the IT security guy's perspective, as many of our listeners out here do, we need to bring balance to the force of what really is permissible to do and what isn't, what clearly crosses the line. At the end of the day, our paychecks come from our employers. And we all have an obligation, a duty, a fiduciary duty to protect those assets. So, looking at this stuff, if this doesn't kind of ring home and think something's wrong, well, then there's something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we have a duty and responsibility to our employers, and certainly to shareholders, but to our coworkers as well, because the damage from a data leak, can start to affect your coworkers as well. So actually, we're going to move to the next slide and talk a little bit about the impacts of a data leak. This was a survey by the Ponemon Institute, and some of the numbers that jumped out at me. I mean, the biggest thing to take away from this is 86% of people, understandably and not surprisingly, have a negative reaction when they find out that their data was part of a data breach.
Right? Absolutely. But Mike, there's some stats or some metrics not on here. When we're talking about public companies, what's the bottom line hit to your stock value? Let me give you an example. I know you were actually quoted in this article over at Softpedia back in late August. IBM, evidently a disgruntled employee at IBM, felt it necessary to let the world know that IBM only did and I say only, tongue-in-cheek, only did $2.6 billion with a B dollars in revenue in the cloud, and they have a goal of getting to $7 billion within 2 years. So immediately, the financial press is, oh my God, IBM's cloud strategy is a failure, and their stock takes a hit. It doesn't take much of an IBM stock hit to have billions of dollars of value down the drain. So the impacts of a data leak, not only on lost customers, are significant, but on if we're in a profit-sharing plan, we're lucky enough to be working at IBM, or unlucky enough to be working at IBM, we just took a big hit on our profit sharing, on our retirement.
That's a great point. It's a great point. And I think, if I recall, that was somebody who was let go, and his motivation appears to be revenge.
Well, that is, it was on one of these here, right? I think it might be coming down further. What motivates insiders to do this stuff?
Yeah. So again, some of the scary stats on a data leak, but data leaks are not the only kind of insider threats that we need to be concerned with. So I wanted to take a minute and talk about another, and that's fraud. And some of these stats really jumped out at me. These are courtesy of the CERT Insider Threat Institute, which is out of Carnegie Mellon University, a very respected organization. And if you look at, if we go back to that theme of we're talking about people with proper access, proper authorization, and using it improperly, how do you find that? How do you flag it? So one of the things that I see a lot of times is people talk about unusual behavior. So if people are doing things at odd times a day, well, here 80% of fraudulent acts were committed during working hours. More than 50% of the cases, the insiders had that form of authorized access that they used. But the ones that really jumped out at me here, the length of time between time to hire and the start of fraudulent activity of 5 years, you're talking about people that have been with your company for a while, they're tenured, they're trusted.
You know what, that's almost counterintuitive to me, Mike, because I know I've worked or I've consulted for companies, large enterprises, and they always have new companies on sort of a probationary period. Yep. Right, so those new guys are under the thumb for the first 90 days. What they're doing is watched. The idea that someone there more than 5 years, I mean, are they deep spies, right, like brought in by birth, or did something happen that turned them at the end of their tenure with the company? Because you think about planting someone there for 5 years before they're going to do something. I just can't imagine that.
No, I think this is more, what you see here is more financial stresses. We've been in a prolonged period of challenging economic times, and you get that trifecta of means, motive, and opportunity.
Yeah.
And so, and that was, financial gain was a motive in 81% of the cases. And then, we touched on, it was a data theft case where revenge was.
Well, revenge is 23%. That's almost a quarter of the cases. It was revenge, and it's disgruntled employees. And remember, no matter how nice your HR department is, wearing the velvet glove around the hammer, no one ever likes to get terminated, fired, or feel like they got the short end of the stick. and they look to strike back. And as you said earlier, it's just so darn easy today to do some of this. It's hard to stay on top of it.
So we spent a little bit of time here talking about, kind of what the insider threat is and what some of the impacts are. So let's shift a bit and talk about how to detect them. So, the first question you ask, what should I be watching for if I want to be able to detect these types of insider threats? And you should certainly be looking at who has access to sensitive information, and we have identity and access management and identity and access governance solutions out there that help doing that. In a previous life, I worked with a lot of solutions that were all about permissions on the network, from NTFS through SharePoint and all the other Microsoft technologies. So you need to keep an eye on those. You need to keep an eye on your data. Data leak prevention technologies are obviously very beneficial. Network usage, applications that are being used as well. And I think the folks on the phone here are doing that already and probably know a lot more about it than I do. But I would submit that you also need to be watching the user, the person interfacing with all of those things.
So Mike, just again a quick, just to kind of give a little color here. Yes, there are solutions available for all of these things you mentioned: access, data, network, and application usage. However, my experience anyway is I am really surprised at the size of the organizations I speak to who have a relatively flat network and don't have proper access and data access policies, not only sort of written but enforced.
Right.
And you're right, there are too many solutions out there that you should use where there's really no excuse to have this kind of stuff.
Sure.
No
Absolutely. So a little bit on watching the user then. I take things out of technology fairly frequently, and I think when you're tasked with guarding something or securing something of importance or value, you certainly want to focus on it and do everything you can to secure it. So you're going to focus on that object. But if you're take an example of an expensive piece of jewelry in a museum setting, you're certainly going to alarm that and have a video camera on it, and you're going to put your focus on that object. But now there's a lot of people milling around that object. And if you were to know that there's a chance, and maybe a fairly decent chance, that one or two of those people might be a jewel thief, you have to watch the people as well to get a full understanding of the threat to that object.
Well, it's common sense, Mike. I mean, I read there was an article, I think it was last week or so, unbeknownst to many of us, maybe some of you online have heard, there's been a rash of ancient, of sterling silver, like very expensive antique silver trophies and stuff that have been stolen throughout the South over a couple of year period, unsolved. Well, it turns out there's this one guy whose reputation is he only steals expensive antique silver. He's like, not a kleptomaniac, but that's his thing. And some retired police detective, I think in Philadelphia or somewhere, came across this guy, and without even doing any of the investigation on the individual crime, said this is the guy. He's got to be. And sure enough, they went to him, and they solved, I don't know, 15 or 20 cases at once. So watching the user, know who your users are.
So let's talk about watching the user a little bit. So by nature of who I am and who I work for, it's probably pretty clear I'm biased. I believe user activity monitoring is necessary. It's very beneficial for companies. We're not alone. I'm not going to read all the words on the screen, but that's a quote from Andrew Walls, a very respected analyst from Gartner, where he recommends that you need to be looking at employee actions and behavior when you have employees interacting with digital systems. The key is to do it the right way, right? And to do it in ways that can preserve the privacy of the employee, especially the employees that are not involved in any of this activity. So you need to have a system in place that was architected and built with that kind of thought process in mind.
So, Mike, I think you said a mouthful at the end there. I have heard, and I've done webinars with Spectrasoft before, and I've been out in the real world talking to people about the product. There are a lot of people who say, oh, well, you're spying, you could use it to spy on your employees. You could. I mean, the same way a vehicle can be used in an improper manner to, you could drive a truck through a crowd of people and cause a lot of hurt and a lot of injuries. Putting it in perspective, in reality, monitoring the right way is the key. And I hope, for those of you listening, the rest of this webinar is going to talk a lot about what is the right way to do this, because there's certainly a right way and a wrong way. I don't advocate spying on people.
No,
and I don't think Spectrasoft does. I don't think you do.
Nope.
But if you do this the right way, it's not spying. It's user activity monitoring, and let's dive into it.
Sure. So let's take a second and just think about the realities of the world and the challenges that we face. And we've talked a little bit about some of this, but I think we all know and accept that interviews and background checks when you're bringing somebody into the organization are not foolproof. If they were, we wouldn't need things like identity and access management solutions. You just give everybody the same permissions and tell them, don't look over there, you're not supposed to look over there, and you'd be fine. The world doesn't work that way,
unfortunately.
We talked earlier about security of the perimeter is critical, but unfortunately, again, today is not enough, and that you have a right and a responsibility to know what's going on within your company, but a responsibility to do it in a way that preserves employee privacy wherever possible. Right? I think the old adage that with great power comes with great responsibility applies here. Yeah, and there are ways to do responsible monitoring that are in the best interest of the overwhelming majority, if not all, your employees. And that's what I want to spend a couple of minutes talking on here. So,
before you jump in,
sure.
Mike, I just want to make sure we're clear. We're not advocating not to do interviews and background checks or not to secure the perimeter. This is all part of, best practices, layered defense in depth. You do all of these things, and hopefully you're catching stuff at every level.
Exactly. Very well said. So, I mentioned earlier that I like to take things out of the technology world where possible. So, I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about airport security and what it can teach us about dealing with insider threats. So, I imagine everyone here has been on a plane recently, or at least known someone that has been. And if you look at the U.S. model for how we're doing airport security today, and it has been effective, everyone is treated with an equal likelihood of being a threat. So we all have to take our shoes off. We all have to take our personal hygiene items and put them in the right size bottle and put them in a clear plastic bag so that everybody can see them when they cross. And we all have to, go through the Exposomatic 3000 machine, which I always take comfort when I do this, that it's worth for the person on the other end monitoring it, that it is for me. But we all have to do those things as we do it, and that's one way of doing it, and it's been effective for us. We got to give the folks that are doing it credit.
But yes, it's been effective. Well, I'm not going to say yes, it's been effective, Mike, because I go both ways on that one. But what really irks me about this model is when I see some little old 80-year-old lady having to go through the full body check because she has an artificial knee or something, and God forbid we mention the profiling word, because we're not allowed to profile, right? It's part of this, it seems, though maybe they do. But everyone is treated exactly the same, and everyone's a threat. And to me, it sort of is like giving people, the TSA agents, a lobotomy. And maybe they need a lobotomy, but, let them use their common sense. This little old lady is probably not the bomber.
Well, anyway, it's interesting that you brought up profiling, because folks can see, an alternative model to the model that the U.S. uses, the Israeli model of security. And they do combine profiling with things like behavioral analysis, body language, and other indicators that I don't know what they are. If I knew, I'd assume they'd have to kill me. And if I told you guys, I'd assume they'd have to kill you too. So it's best that we just leave it for they have a secret sauce way that they do this. But one element that they use is profiling. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And the first thing I wanted to address, the question is, isn't profiling a bad thing? And I want to be absolutely clear that it depends on what you profile on, and if you profile based on who a person is, their race, their creed, their gender, that's not how we do things in America. That's not what we're recommending here. What we're talking about is more looking at things that we know statistically present risk to a company, and then addressing those situations in a different manner. So keeping this out of the technology world for a little bit, let me see if I can walk you through an exercise to see if you would ever profile. So consider a situation, you're having a party at your house. You have a nice house. You have some nice stuff in your house. It's stuff you would like to hang on to. You've invited a lot of people to the house. You got about 100 guests. You learn that of those 100 guests, 50 of them think it's okay to take something with them, a souvenir, when they leave the house. You further learn that of these 50 people, they typically take that something as they're leaving, on their way out the door. So the question is, wouldn't you keep an eye on the people with the keys in their hands? I believe the answer is that you would. And if you think back to the statistics we shared earlier, where 51% of people said it's okay to take corporate data with them, then they leave. Well, that's a way you can look at. We have this high-risk exit period, where as people are leaving a company, whether it's by their own choice or something that's being forced upon them, we know that people take corporate data. So wouldn't you want to keep an eye on activity then in a heightened way to make sure you're securing your data and preserving the internal security for all the reasons we talked about earlier?
So Mike, let's drive that home to IT. So if we know an employee is on probation, his performance, he's been brought in on performance and given a plan or what have you, there's nothing the matter with saying, you know what, that employee now fits the profile of someone who may be making putting his affairs in order to leave the company, which may include taking corporate data, and therefore, shouldn't we maybe keep an eye on that employee? Now, is that profiling based on race, creed, sex, gender, etc.? Of course not.
Yep.
Is it wrong? You know what, I'd be really interested in people in our audience. Do they think that's wrong? Because I certainly don't. I think that's common sense.
Well, I think, companies have for a long time accepted that there are times where you tilt the balance from employee privacy to security, right? Employee investigations have been going on for a very long time. The different methodologies are used. People pull through emails, they scrape logs, they use our software, software like ours, to do those investigations. The thing is, there's a trigger, there's a reason to do it, and the company's at peace with, my interests now have to take some precedence, right? So I think that we have to look at what are some of those other reasons beyond a tip or a complaint or suspicion that someone's doing something wrong, and something like a high-risk exit period would be another reason to take a look at what's going on the network.
Sure. Probable cause.
Good term. So as we think about this and we bring it back into IT, as you said, Alan, well, let's talk about how you balance employee privacy and security, or in my Star Wars geekiness, how you restore balance to the Force.
Okay, Skywalker.
So I think it's, reconnaissance is an interesting word. If you look at the dictionary definition of it, it's a preliminary survey looking for some kind of activity. So you want to try to find a way that lets you do that without violating privacy, but there are some other steps that you need to take too. The first is to put the ability to review user activity data, especially any that has any detail in it, in the hands of the right people. Now, the right people are going to differ based on your company and your organization and your structure. In some cases, it may be an owner. In some cases, it may be HR. It could be legal. As part of your process of going through and deciding on implementing a user activity monitoring solution and strategy, that's one of your decision points, is to decide who should be reviewing this data, and then make sure that you keep the power to do that in their hands and their hands only. For the IT crowd here, you guys are highly skilled professionals. You've got more initials after your name than I can ever hope to have, but I don't think you signed up to be judge and jury on your peers. Your task is more to provide the solutions that can help people secure. In this case, we're talking about internally, and to have the knowledge of them, so that if the time comes when somebody in a corner office says, I want to go about securing against internet threats, you can say, hey, I'm aware of some technologies we can use. And I think that's a large part of the reason why folks are here today.
Yep. And Mike, let me see if I can crystallize this for some of our listeners and attendees today. IT people, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. One of the only thing I learned from that is that men generally like to solve problems.
Yep.
So, and IT people, whether they be men or women, we're problem solvers, right? I need some code that allows me to do this. Bam, I'm going to develop some code. I need a solution that allows me to do that. I'll find the solution or I'll make the solution that does it. Can't emphasize enough, we solve problems. We don't necessarily go in search of problems.
Yep.
And we come up with solutions to problems when that's our job. And so I think what you're saying, and I want to make sure we're clear on this, is that the decision to utilize user activity monitoring and the decision on who should be doing the monitoring, whether it be in one set of hands or many sets of hands or bifurcated or what have you, that is, in many companies, an executive level decision.
Absolutely.
Right? It's not something that the sysadmin decides that he's going to do, right? It has to come from a CFO or somebody up the ladder. Yep. And we're in agreement?
Absolutely we are.
Okay. So I think it's our duty as IT people to make them aware of the capabilities.
Yep.
Make them aware of the threat. But it's got to be someone with that authority who makes the call here.
No, I agree. I agree. The next point here is to not monitor everybody in the same way, and we're going to talk a little bit about this in a slide or two. But we talked about a scenario where if you have people exiting the company, as an example, you might want to monitor them in a different way than someone who's not exiting the company. And then you want to take steps to stay out of people's personal business, right? The work-life line has blurred. People spend more time working now than they used to. The day doesn't end at 5. People need to do some personal things when they're at work. So you want to make sure that you take steps to stay out of their business and that you're using a solution that enables you to kind of strike that balance. Every company is different. Every company is going to put that balance in differently between privacy and security, and you want to make sure that you've looked at something that gives you the right options.
Mike, it goes back to what you said before, and which I said was dead on, which is intelligently administrating this is the key.
Yep.
Between making it a nuisance or versus a very valuable tool.
Sure. So let's take, as we stay on the theme of how you implement something like this and being intelligent about it, we'll stop for a second and start at step 1, which is to make sure you have an acceptable use policy in place, and then in that acceptable use policy you disclose to everybody in your company that you have and you may exercise the right to monitor their activity on company-issued devices and on the company network, right? If you don't have an acceptable use policy, the link up on the screen here takes you to a white paper that has a very good sample acceptable use policy in it. I would certainly not recommend that you just take it word for word. I would have somebody legally review it, and I would make sure that it's right for your company. But we have gone to the step of producing a sample one that's a really, really solid starting point for getting a good acceptable use policy in place, and that's always got to be the first step.
Mike, I want to stop right here if we can. People on the webinar, that might be the most important slide you're going to see here today, because again, in speaking to people who are pro and con on user activity monitoring, there's one thing they agree on. Do not do this without an AUP. And we've heard questions in the past, whether I'm from an EU country versus the USA or Asia or some other part of the world. I really don't care where on Earth you are or even on the moon. If you're doing this without an AUP, you're not using it in its intended use. You're driving the truck through the crowd.
Sure.
And so can't emphasize enough. Guys, take advantage. They're giving you a great AUP as a boilerplate here, template. Take it, do with it what you will, or start your own from scratch. But a good AUP is the key here.
Okay, good. So moving forward then, I'm going to take one slide here to just talk a little bit about what SpectraSoft does and what our technology does, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the ways that you can maintain privacy using a solution like this. So we create software that monitors user activity. We collect a lot of data. You can see the types of data that we collect up on the screen. We aggregate that out. It can be reported on, alerted on, it can even be played back like you're watching a DVR. So if you really want to be able to see something that happened from the eyes of the actor, it's very easy to do. So when you start to think about, in the case of a reactive use of employee activity monitoring, when you need to know what happened, rather than going through and pulling email and scraping logs and doing all the steps that you have to take, we've consolidated that information in one place, made it very easy to see with the context what happened before, during, and after a certain event. So with that power, as we talked about earlier, and the amount of data that we do collect, you need to make sure that you're taking appropriate steps to preserve privacy. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of our customers do and what some of the options are in our product. So staying on that theme of restoring balance to the force, the balance between employee privacy and security, one of the interesting things that a lot of our customers do is they split the SA password that gives people access to the database where the data is stored. And I've seen literally eight character passwords where 4 are in the hands of IT and 4 are in the hands of HR, as an example. It's a very powerful way of making sure that proper policies are used to enable access to that data. So
maybe our government should do that. Let's not go there. Go ahead, Mike.
So that's just one common sense, easy way that people use. But there are things that we've architected into our solution. I talked about not monitoring everybody in the same way. Depending on what your goals are and what you're concerned about, you want to have options as to what you monitor. So you may be worried about access to sensitive data for a group of people or a certain person. Well, you might want to just go through and monitor program activity, what applications they're using, and what documents they're doing, and what they're doing with those documents they're using. So you might enable program activity and document tracking, but you're not worried about where they're going on the web. You just don't monitor it. That's one of the options that are built into our solution that enable you to start thinking about privacy. I talked about staying out of your employees' personal business. Very easy to come into our solution and block sites you don't want to record. Vast majority of employees use direct deposit today. It's not that hard to pull together a list of the banks that you're doing business with. We don't have any need to be inside our employees' personal banking accounts. Just block the site so that they can go there and be private and don't have to worry about anybody reporting what's going on those sites.
Mike, can you just explain, when we say block the sites, not that we're blocking the users from going those sites, we are blocking the user activity monitoring software from monitoring activity when they go to those sites.
You're exactly right, and if I was unclear, I apologize, but that's exactly it. They can still go about, as we talked about, the blurring of the work-life balance there. They can still go about doing that. We just don't record that information because you're told the solution not to do it. Another thing you can do is just not capture passwords when your employees are surfing the web. That keeps you out of their social media accounts and all that other stuff. You don't need their credentials for things like that, so it's another option that you can go in. And as you're building this kind of privacy policy for how you would implement this solution or implement a solution like it, it's another step you can take. And then the last, and we've touched on this a little, is to establish levels of review. Not everybody should be able to access the same level of data to review it. So you want to have a solution that enables you to grant the power to look at data to the appropriate people. And again, that's going to differ based on your company, but you could certainly go in and say, if we want to see email activity, only HR can do that. As may not be the best example, or chat and IM activity, they're restricted to different people. And in that way, you kind of, first of all, take yourself as the IT guy out of having to bear that burden of being the one that's going through all that information. But more importantly, it lets you put that power in the right folks inside your company. So you're really enabling the management of the company to have good corporate governance and doing it in a way that was designed with employee privacy in mind.
So, Mike, two things on a couple of the things you said here. First of all, on the issue of recording users' passwords, in my mind, unless it's a company-owned asset, which is password protected, which hopefully an administrator in the company has a list of those passwords anyway, you're only asking for trouble to store your employee's password, right?
Yep.
Or something like that. Because once you start storing that, now you have an obligation to keep it secure for them. And when something goes wrong, we've got to, it's a can of worms, frankly, that you don't want to open. So my advice would be, don't do that. I mean, don't take on the potential contingent liability, as we used to call it.
Yep.
That's a contingent liability you don't need. Secondly, very, very important and powerful tool, Mike, is the delegation of responsibilities and duties here. The same way we said the IT admin isn't the guy who makes the decision on whether to use activity monitoring or not. He's probably not the one who decides, I want to monitor Mary Jane's email messages either. right? There's really no reason for Joe in IT to monitor Mary Jane's email messages. He just enables email monitoring.
Correct.
Someone who has a damn good reason to monitor or to actually do it is the person responsible for it. So we're talking about using it the right way, using the tool for its intended use. That's what it's about. Too many times I've seen, and we're all guilty of it in the IT world, because after all, we are omnipotent, and the dark side does take us over, and who knows better than us. But we try to take too much onto ourselves. We have too much ability. As a matter of fact, when we talk about insider threats, a lot of those insider threats are disgruntled IT employees who have administrator-level access to all kinds of data on the network, and when we leave, we take it with us too. So again, really, really important. Balance means delegating authority to the proper people.
No, well said. So I think just to recap some of the things we've talked about as you go about down implementing a solution like this, you want to have involvement from the top levels of your company. You want to spend the time identifying the right people in your company to review this type of data. You want to make sure you have an acceptable use policy in place that is clear and that your employees acknowledge. And you want to make sure that any solution you use, the people that built it took some time to think about employee privacy and put the power in your hands to strike the balance that's the right one for your company. Now, we went through some of the options that exist in our product currently today. I wanted to take just a little bit of time here, one more slide, to talk about, if I stay on the Star Wars theme, and I appreciated the dark side plug, Alan, to talk about another option. If what you've seen is not sufficient for you, then there's the option of seeking out the chosen one, the one to restore balance to the force. And that would be a solution that records and logs this kind of digital activity, that looks at the communications layer, communications fabric, and the online fabric of a company, and keeps it stored encrypted and obfuscated on a local machine where it occurs, scans that activity, and alerts on insider threat indicators. We talked about fraud earlier. There are really well-known indicators of corporate fraud. An example would be an accountant typing "it's a gray area." I married into a family of accountants, and one of the things that I've learned is that there are no gray areas in accounting. That's what my wife tells me every time she said, "Where did all the money go?" And I try to say it's a gray area. But there are indicators. There are keywords and phrases. Ernst & Young and the FBI have pulled together, and it's very easy to find online. It's off the books. Management will never find out. Those types of phrases can be indicators of fraud, as an example. So you want a solution that looks for those indicators and alerts on them, but that puts the control of whether that recorded data is ever unlocked in the hands, as we've discussed now, in the right people. And if you can find a solution that's doing that and looking for all those things, it enables you to broaden out your employee monitoring strategy, because it is fully keeping privacy in mind. That data is never accessed. It's much like a flight recorder on an airplane or a black box. You only look at it if there was a problem, and it's kept locked away if there wasn't a problem. So that's a future solution that we wanted to touch on a little bit, and the good news is it is coming soon.
It's a near future solution.
Very future soon, and balance will be restored fully to the force later this month.
Well, that's certainly a plug to leave them hanging, Mike. Later this month, just the 24th, you said, so it's about 2 weeks away.
Correct.
And again, not to trade on futures here, but this would seem to be a solution, and I haven't seen it yet, but this would seem to be a solution that does the recon and monitoring, but it really is locked away, and you break the glass in case of emergency.
That's a good analogy, yes. Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about, and hopefully
sounds interesting.
Folks will keep an eye out for it. So with that, I think we've come to the end of the material we wanted to cover today.